On the surface, it would appear that fatigue management should be a relatively simple problem to solve. Just limit the hours of work that people undertake. And indeed, in Europe, the European Working Time Directive took exactly that approach and specified in legislation that it was now not permitted for people to work than so many hours. The problem with that approach in Australia, however, is that it creates a huge challenge for us. Australia is unique in the fact that we now work some of the longest hours in the world. I think we now work the second longest working hours after the US, and we have the greatest proportion of people working more than 55 hours a week, courtesy of the recent mining boom, although that may well change over the next few years. But the bottom line is that people are working longer and harder, and work intensification over the last 5 to 10 years has created a major problem for industry in terms of how to manage fatigue, but how to continue with the productivity benefits associated with long working hours. If we look at the tradition of working hours in Australia, then there has been a very long trend of increasing work hours and increasing intensity of work. If you go back to the mid-80s and then look forward over the next 20 or 30 years, you can see two broad periods in history. From 1985 to 1995, we saw a very significant increase in enterprise bargaining agreements and a devolution of the negotiation process for an enterprise bargain from the traditional format where employers and unions would get together in the commission to one in which people would get together at the firm level. As a consequence, over the last 10 to 20 years, and particularly in that first period between 1985 and 1995, we saw a decentralisation of the industrial relations process and in effect people negotiating at the firm level with their boss to say, I want more money, and employers saying, well, if you want more money, we want you to work more hours. So in that period from 85 to 95, we saw the vast majority of enterprise bargaining agreements involve changes to hours of work, and in all but a handful that involved people working longer hours or longer blocks of hours. While that's been very good in terms of improving productivity per employee, maybe not per hour, but at least net productivity per week, it's also carried a number of consequences. And one of those consequences is fatigue. The second thing that we have seen in terms of the industrial relations landscape, and this is primarily the period between 1995 and the present, is that we've seen a situation in which third-party representation rights in the Industrial Relations Commission have been removed. Up until 1995, I used to often be requested by an Industrial Relations Commission to come in and give an opinion to the Commissioner as to whether a shift system was likely to be safe or not, and that would impact on the negotiation between employers and employees. Post-1995, those third-party representational rights in the Commission were significantly reduced, and as a consequence, the negotiation between the employer and the employee happened without any right of somebody to communicate on behalf of the community. And in many cases, scientific or research evidence was not able to be factored into the decisions that were required to be made by the Industrial Relations Commission. The net consequence of these two trends, that is the decentralisation of the industrial relations process and the removal of third-party representation rights, meant that in most cases people were negotiating on the spot with their employer about changes to working time arrangements. One of the difficulties with this approach, however, is that in many cases neither the employer nor the employee were necessarily informed, and in many cases people engaged in what has been referred to as a conspiracy of greed. That is, in exchange for increased pay, people worked increased hours. And the net consequence of this has been the rise of fatigue as an issue in the workplace. The second aspect that we'd like you to think about in terms of the challenge of fatigue management is the fact that prescription of working time can actually produce paradoxical results. One of the best examples of this was some work we were doing with Queensland Rail back in the 1990s, and in that particular organisation the CEO had had an epiphany, had decided that fatigue was no longer an acceptable risk for the organisation, and made a very significant decision to commit publicly to managing fatigue at that organisation. He got up in public and on all the training videos and said to the staff, it is no longer acceptable for somebody to be at work for more than 12 hours, and I don't care even if I have to stop the train and take the drivers out of the train and drive them back to work, and it's only 35 or 40 minutes away, I will make that commitment to reduce the risks associated with working while fatigued. And on the surface, that seemed like a very big development by the organisation and a major commitment at a moral level by the CEO. But I also remember at the same time stopping and asking the question, what will you do with the tired drivers? And the CEO saying, well, I will get them to drive a car back to the depot, and that will be the same car that the drivers took out to relieve them. And if you stop and think about that, there's actually a paradoxical element to that. While we stop the person driving the train, we then put them into a car, and that drive home is actually far more risky for that driver than actually continuing to drive back to the depot. And in that story, we see one of the key issues that we need to deal with in fatigue management is that sometimes what looks like a simple and straightforward approach actually produces paradoxical outcomes. While you may reduce the risk of fatigue, at the local level, you may actually increase risk to the overall system. A lot of what we talk about in this lecture series will be how an organisation balances the challenges of simple prescription versus complex risk management approaches. I think this can be summed up, as was famously said by H.L. Mencken many years ago, for every complex problem, there is a simple solution, and it's usually wrong. The third part of the challenge in fatigue management is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Despite the fact that many regulators will try to argue to the contrary, assessing and managing the risks of fatigue can be very different for different types of work groups, workforces, or different types of tasks. At the most simple, consider the following situation. I have two tired people. One person's job is to land a jumbo jet at New York in the middle of a snowstorm, and the other person's job is to operate the photocopy machine. As a community, we are probably more concerned about the person landing the plane than the person operating the photocopy machine. For the photocopy machine operator, the worst that can happen is that they may fall asleep and get 2 copies instead of 1. They may get a paper cut. They may fall asleep on the glass platen. But at the end of the day, the consequences of fatigue are relatively trivial when we compare those to what would be the case in a pilot landing a jumbo jet who made a fatigue-related error. One of the big challenges around fatigue management in the last decade has been that shift away from rules based on determining how fatigued you are and prescribing working time arrangements based around that principle to those which assess the level of risk. And one of the key factors that we'll expect you to think about in this course is the link between the likelihood of fatigue and the consequence of fatigue. Risk is actually a function of the product of the likelihood and consequence. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but for many of you who have been through a risk management process, you'll know that you multiply likelihood by consequence to determine the risk. Up until recently, it has been relatively unusual for organisations to factor in the consequence of a fatigue-related error in any systematic way. But what we hope by the end of this course is that you will be able to look at both the likelihood of fatigue, the consequence of fatigue, and to be able to make a risk-based decision on what would be the most appropriate way to manage that risk.